Pleased to have with us in the studio Kevin Kamps, the Radioactive Waste Watchdog with Beyond Nuclear. BeyondNuclear.org is the website, and you can tweet him at Beyond Nuclear. Kevin, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Great having you with us. You got to get within 3 inches of that mic there for us to hear you. 6 years after Fukushima began normalizing radiation exposure risks to the health of women and men and women, the evacuees are given few options but to return to contamination. There's a headline. What's the story? What's going on at Fukushima right now?
Yeah, my coworker, Cindy Folkers, who is our radiation and health hazard specialist, just wrote an article in Counterpunch that traced the word origin of the word radiophobia. And it turns out that it comes all the way from 1951 during the height of atmospheric weapons testing days. And it was written by a nuclear establishment type who was making good money in the nuclear establishment, had no credentials in psychology, and just dismissed everybody's concerns about radiation health damage, called it radiophobia. It's all in your head. It's your fault. It's your problem. So that was used quite extensively at Chernobyl. It's being used at Fukushima. And so what's going on at Fukushima is the pro-nuclear Japanese government is moving people back, forcing people to move back to contaminated areas under threat of losing their compensation. And the compensation is going to end about a year from now. So people are given the choice of being destitute elsewhere in Japan or moving back to their former homes, which are radioactively contaminated, and keeping compensation for another year at least. But mothers who are concerned about their children's health are being accused of radiophobia, that it's all in their head. But in fact, they have increased allowable radiation exposures 20-fold in these areas around Fukushima.
Germany did the same thing with milk after Chernobyl. I was living in Germany, 86, 87, and they, it was, I think, 5 becquerels per liter, and then they took it up to 20, and then they took it to 50, and then they took it to 100, and just because the milk was getting more and more radioactive, and rather than dumping it, they just kept changing the standards, as I recall.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
The Soviets were even worse. It came out 10 years after Chernobyl began in 1996 that the Soviet Politburo had ordered contaminated foods of various sorts, milk, meat, to be mixed in with the food supply of the entire Soviet Union and to dissipate or dilute the radioactivity. But of course, what that meant was that food that should have been quarantined and destroyed because it was unfit for human consumption now was exposing millions or tens of millions of people to radioactive exposures. The same kind of thing's happening in Japan, where, what's really incredible is the Japanese food safety standards post-Fukushima are much stronger than American or Canadian standards. So the figure in Japan is 100 becquerels per kilogram of radioactive cesium in food. That's considered legal and edible. In the United States, it's 1,200.
Really?
So what that means is that Japan's contaminated food can be exported to the United States and sold legally on the open market.
Is it?
You have to assume. There have been stories that have come out where food from Fukushima Prefecture itself was not marked as such, and it was supposed to be, showing up in various parts of Asia. And once that scandal was uncovered, certain countries have banned all imports from not just Fukushima, but from other neighboring prefectures. So there's been a real blowback against this deception that's going on, trying to keep it quiet. That food out of Fukushima is being sold.
I had somebody call the other day about this who was saying, because Fukushima, the meltdown continues, the robots are dying, they can't get a handle on this. There's enormous amounts of radioactive water continuously, every day, every second, pouring into the Pacific Ocean. Concerned that fish that migrate from our side of the Pacific to the Japanese side of the Pacific, particularly presumably large fish like tuna, might be bringing cesium with them, and of course, it's the plume has already crossed the Pacific, or they might just be picking it up in the normal course of swimming around and breathing water and all that kind of stuff, running it through their gills, whatever the word is for fish. Mm-hmm. How real a risk is that if you are eating Pacific Ocean fish, that you may be getting a dose of radiation with your food, and what percentage of the fish that comes out of the West Coast, and particularly for people who live on the West Coast or west of the Mississippi, presumably, what percentage of that fish is actually tested for radioactive material before it ends up on our dinner plates?
Actually, Pacific bluefin tuna was documented in August of 2011, so 5 months after Fukushima began, as measurably contaminated with radioactive cesium. It had grown as a juvenile stage on the northeastern coast of Japan there, near Fukushima, had swam across the ocean and carried the radioactivity in its own flesh over to the west coast of North America. So that was 5 months after Fukushima began. We're now 6 years.
And that was 6 years ago.
We're now 6 years beyond that. And so that plume you mentioned has contaminated, incredibly enough, the Pacific Ocean all the way from Japan to the west coast of North America, doubled in radioactivity content because of Fukushima, artificial radioactivity. It already had pollution from atom bomb testing galore in the Pacific and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere that went on for years and decades. And then Fukushima alone doubled the registered readings of things like cesium-134, cesium-137 in open ocean water, lapping on the shores of the west coast of North America. And the dynamic that you have to watch out for big time is bioaccumulation, bioconcentration, biomagnification, where fish species like bluefin tuna, other predatory fish species that are at the top of the food chain are going to have a concentrated dose of radioactivity. Big fish eats little fish. Little fish is already radioactively contaminated, and it just builds up. And so that testing question you asked, the United States government, since Fukushima began, has been derelict in its duty, has not been testing the food supply. It's woefully inadequate what's going on. And in terms of atmospheric measurements in the first days and weeks after Fukushima, it was revealed that something like a third of the Environmental Protection Agency's radiation monitors in the United States were dysfunctional. They were not operating. The batteries hadn't been replaced. And it, showed utter incompetence for one thing, but I think it's even worse than incompetence. It's an intentional downplaying of the health risks of Fukushima fallout.
So it's the EPA and presumably the USDA who are responsible for this. I mean, these are agencies that with the Trump administration, they want to slash radically. So odds are we're never going to find out how radioactive our food is.
Unless we turn things around. I mean, to give credit where credit's due, or negative credit, the Obama administration on January 19th, hours before Trump took the oath of office, finalized a scandalous policy. It's called Protective Action Guidelines for Radioactivity in Drinking Water. And what the Obama administration did was increased allowable levels of radioactivity, and it depends on the isotope you're talking about, tens of times, hundreds of times, thousands of times, millions of times, depending on the isotope. It was a wholesale regulatory rollback, and it was based on what the Japanese government was able to get away with post-Fukushima. The U.S. decided if it's good enough for Japan, it's good enough for us. They just sold a shop on radioactivity in water post-nuclear incident.
Whoa. So who's beyondnuclear.org, I'm assuming, is pushing back on this? Are there other groups? Is anybody raising a stink about this? I mean, you might want to talk about Chernobyl heart. I mean, what's the consequence of eating cesium or strontium?
Yes. I mean, Nuclear Information and Resource Service has watchdogged that attempt to roll back those regulations for decades and was able to stop it time and time again, even during the George W. Bush years. They tried at the end of the George W. Bush administration to do this. What Obama ended up doing, despite best efforts by groups like Nuclear Information and Resource Service, was to do worse than W was going to do.
Whoa. Is this because of a revolving door at these agencies? Is this because of lobbying by the nuclear industry? Is this because there's some legitimate reason to do it? I mean, why?
It makes the world a whole lot easier for the nuclear power industry. If they have an incident and they leave it that ambiguous, it's not necessarily a nuclear power catastrophe of the scale of Fukushima or Chernobyl. It could be something like a medical isotope shipment in a vehicle that crashes and releases its contents into the environment. Any incident all along that spectrum, these are going to be the allowable levels of radioactivity in water until the U.S. government can get its handle on things, and that could take years. Wow. So people will be exposed to, and you mentioned Chernobyl heart, radioactive cesium-134, radioactive cesium-137. Where does that go in the human body? It goes to muscle tissue, including the heart. And so Chernobyl Heart is the title of an Oscar award-winning short documentary from over a decade ago that showed that congenital heart defects in babies in Chernobyl are bad.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Kevin Kamps, Radioactive Waste Watchdog with Beyond Nuclear, beyondnuclear.org. Kevin, thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much.
We'll be right back.